So one of the tools we're going to learn under topic 6 is how to conduct a category analysis. So first we have to start off with our sourcing matrix here, our strategic sourcing matrix. So we're not going to look at everything. We're going to look at the leverage and critical categories. Those are the two that we're going to get the most bang for our buck by doing category management or category analysis, which will lead us into our category management. So we need to know the critical facts here. So when we're performing it, we need to have some objectives. We need to gather internal fact information, such as our company's buying status and the nature of the item and the process. You need to know these things. And then we have our external factors. So what is the supply and demand for these items? And then our outcomes that we need to know these also. The price and availability, which is going to be based off supply and demand, and how can we improve and how can we manage our risk. So if we know this stuff, we're pretty good to start the process. If you're not sure of this stuff, take a little extra time and research that. That way you can have good answers and good data, so when you move forward, you're not going back and reinventing the wheel and starting over again. So let's look at the facts. We need to look inside our company. So we need to know what we're buying and why we're buying it. So what am I buying and why does my company buy this item? For example, I used to work at a location where they never bought black pens. That might sound odd, but once you found out why, it made sense. So there was a lot of documents that they would sign, individuals would sign, that could be copied. And they knew with how copy technology is going on, so like a Xerox machine, that it's almost impossible to tell the difference between an original and a copy. I mean, there's some copiers that are just that good. So by implementing blue pens, they were able to make sure that anything that had blue ink on it, because they only had black and white copiers, they didn't want to spend the money for color copiers, that if it had blue ink on it, that was the original. And all copies would have black for the signature. So they knew what one was the original and which one was not. Now, this might sound a little crazy, but when you're talking about legal documents and such like that, blue ink is usually what you're going to sign with if you're signing to buy a house, or if you have anything to do with the law and go to court. Most documents are signed in blue. So think about that. That's something that sounds silly, but it makes sense. So knowing the why can make you understand. You go, oh, okay, that makes sense. So let's change this up a little and look at a sample bill of materials for a woman's road bike. So a professional road bike for a woman, model number MT2000. Well, you need a frame, you need a front fork, you need a standard wheel subassembly, a gear assembly, and a dual pad seat for a woman. But we have that subassembly in there, that standard wheel subassembly. Well, we have the wheels and spokes under that, a tire, and a wheel rim. You need those three pieces to make that standard wheel subassembly. So now we know what we need here, and I mean, all that makes sense. If you know of a bicycle, you need all those pieces. I don't see any brakes or reflectors, which are generally on bikes, but who knows? Maybe that's customized when the person buys the bicycle. So we need to understand the nature of the item. So what do we need to know? We need to understand the production process. So like when you looked at those bill of materials and I mentioned how there's brakes were not mentioned on there. Well, the production process, like I said, maybe that's an option that a customer can choose when they're purchasing the bike. So, or they buy it from a bicycle shop and they can choose what brakes go on it. Or maybe the company is just saving money by not including brakes and the customers are okay with that. So we also need to understand the item composition. You remember how there was that subassembly that I went over. So you needed the spokes, the rim, and the wheel, or the tire for that subassembly. Well, that's good things to know. Okay, you need to understand the labor content. How labor intensive is your process? Especially for production. Because maybe you should source it where it's already built together. For example, that wheel, yeah, you can buy the rubber separately from the spokes and the wheel rim, but what if you bought it and it was already put together? You just need to add air. That might be better than having your own company put it all together. These things you can learn by talking to people. And you need to understand the use and substitutes. So understand why we're buying those specific items and what are acceptable substitutions. If you're making a high-end professional road bike, there might not be some substitutes you can do. Where if you're just making a regular casual use bicycle that anybody can pick up at Walmart, well, maybe you can do some substitutions and it doesn't need to have the higher end materials. You can use lower end materials. So what about the company's buying status? So what has the company purchased in the past? How much did you buy? How have circumstances changed? Is production increased? Is production decreased because demand is increased or decreased? Maybe the price of materials has changed. Who did you buy from in the past? Are they the best supplier? You might want to take a look and see if there's maybe other suppliers you can look at and purchase from. So what transportation arrangements did you need to make to assure on-time delivery? So on-time delivery for the parts and the on-time delivery of the final product to your customer. Now, how did you do that? Is it your own company providing the trucks? Or are you outsourcing that to a transportation company, a logistics company, or a 3PL, a third-party logistics company? So you need to know those kind of things. And you can see that because there's a purchase record, right? Well, what if you've never purchased this item before? Well, you can usually find something similar. And it might be just a similar category. Like, for example, if you're buying blue pens, well, if you bought black pens, you should be able to buy blue pens, right? I mean, do you go to Office Depot, do you go to Staples, or do you just buy straight from the source? You know, it might be Bic as the source. So if you use the reference points for a similar item, that could be a great point to start from. Or you can just start from scratch. You know, you can start from the very beginning, like an unknown item. So just do a simple Google search. Just type in that you're looking for a blue pen and see what shows up. Look at the companies that supply this stuff. If you see the same company over and over and over, that might be a company you may want to reach out to. You might also look to see where are these companies located. There might be a blue pen manufacturer down the street. Well, you could probably save on shipping by just sending somebody over to pick it up or having them drop it off at your doorstep. You can do all these different things. So yeah, you may have to start from scratch, from nothing. But let's look outside our company. So supply and demand determines price and availability. As anybody has ever taken an economics class, you know that where supply and demand intersect, that will determine your price. And the companies that produce that item will only produce up to that amount because they're getting the best price for it. If they overproduce, meaning more supply, well, the price would probably go down. If demand increases with the same supply, price is probably going to go up. But, you know, this is not an economics class. I just pretty much hit the highlights of supply and demand. But just know that supply and demand determines your price and availability. So keep that in mind. So then we have beyond total supply. So we need to track and understand the capabilities and capacities of existing suppliers. Are they able to meet our needs? Can they meet our demand? We need to develop a clear picture of available suppliers. We need to know what suppliers are out there, what they're capable of, and that way when it comes time, let's say supplier A says no, they can't meet our demand. Well, we have supplier B, C, D, E, F, as far as you want to go, of potential backups. And maybe that backup will become the primary. Who knows? All right, the plan. What's your plan in case there's a supply disruption? Let's say your primary supplier has a fire and they had to shut down and they're going to be unable to ship anything for 30 days. What's your backup? What about if there was a natural disaster and your supplier is unable to send a supply to you? Or there's a pandemic and the governor ordered that everybody should stay home. You know, all these things can impact your supply chain. So how are you going to deal with that when it happens? Well, let's go back and take a look at supply and demand. We need to track this. So here's a chart of the total supply and total demand for aluminum. So we need to know that supply is just one side of the equation, which in this chart would be the top line or the red line. So you see supply is higher than demand. Well, it takes a lot of work to get aluminum into a form that can be used by many companies. So that level of work, you know, sometimes they can buy it cheap, so they'll buy more, so there's a bigger supply. And sometimes the price is higher, so they don't buy as much, which, I mean, you see here the demand line never crosses over the supply line. So we need to be aware of the overall category demand because you're not the only company that's sourcing that aluminum. You may not be the only company that's sourcing iron or sourcing this electronic circuit board. There may be competitors out there that are trying to take the product, and that may make it where you don't have the quantity that you need. So these are some things that you need to think about when you're sourcing. So let's dig a little deeper into demand. So we have the average aluminum usage per vehicle. So if we look back to 1985, it was 139. Now it doesn't give a unit of measure, but it's 139. Then we get to 2015, a mere, 30 years later? It's almost tripled the amount of aluminum in a vehicle. And that may be because the government has mandated certain fuel standards. And one way to reach those fuel standards is to lighten the weight of a car or a vehicle. So, aluminum is in higher and higher demand. So this is just one example of how demand can change over time. And you can see just over the period of 30 years, it's almost tripled. So with all that, we need to be aware of the price and availability, those outcomes from all this. So we need to think of these questions here. What does the historical price and future trends in pricing look like? Well, we just saw a chart that showed the usage of aluminum. Our next slide, we're going to see the price of aluminum per metric ton. So what does it cost to produce and deliver this item? And then finally, what are the profit margins of suppliers and their pricing objectives? If you understand that aluminum is worth $1,000 per ton, well, what is the supplier's markup? Is the supplier trying to get a markup of 10% or a margin of 10%? So that might mean they sell it for $1,100. Well, can you negotiate that and maybe get it for $1,050? It's possible. So understanding your supplier is going to help with that. So let's see this chart here. So we put supply and demand together and we get insight into price and availability. So you can see the price over time here. We have, let's say, July and January from 2007 all the way through 2017. So you can see that the price of aluminum has jumped pretty much all over the place, and it looks like it's starting to kind of get a little more steady as the chart goes on. So the highest of $3,067 per metric ton. So a metric ton is 2,200 pounds. So if you look at this chart here, so in July of 2008, it was at a highest price on the chart. But just 6 months later, in January 2009, it was at the lowest point on this chart at $1,420. That's a huge difference there, to go from one extreme to the other in just 6 months on this chart. But then it kind of looks like it's leveling out. So you can probably expect to pay in June of 2017 probably between $1,500 and $1,800 is my guess. Just taking a guess at this chart. So if you look at the historical prices like this, you can kind of pick where the price is. And you might be able to lock in a contract that you can have a set price for a period of time. So let's look at continuous improvement, because we always have to try to improve our process. And then we also have to mitigate risk whenever we can. So we need to know, how can we secure the supply of our materials? Do we put it under contract? Do we have an open contract with the company? Or do we just do a transaction by transaction? What do we need to do? How can I drive cost reduction over time? You know, things generally get more expensive over time. Let's say they go up at 3%. Well, what if you can negotiate only a 2% increase in price? Well, you just saved 1%. And while it may not feel like it because the price went up 2%, you can argue that you saved 2 because the inflation rates might be 3%. So, how can you improve your current supply relationships? You know, think about that. You know, talking to your suppliers, getting to know them. So when you have a problem and you call them, they're more than willing to help you, because you've developed that relationship. You know the name of their wife, their husband, their kids, their dog, that their kid has just graduated high school or college or whatever. You know this kind of information. You know, that's kind of the advanced relationships that you can develop. But if you know that kind of information, your supplier is probably giving you pretty good pricing because they have that trust. And can you find or develop better suppliers? That's a possibility. You should always be looking out there to see if there's another supplier. And can I work with internal customers to improve the process? This is internal to your company. Do you have to wait until they come into your office and say, I need more of this? And usually they wait till the last minute, which means you need to jump through hoops to get it done now. Or can you improve the process where you know ahead of time that, okay, next week they're going to be looking for this item, so I need to make sure it's here. You know, how can you improve that process? And what else can you do to improve the competitive position for your company? So securing better pricing is great, but what else can you do? Now you need to think about that. So this is, developing understanding a category plan or category analysis. All of this stuff put together is what you need to think about, because there may be something here that can help you out when you're developing your category plan. If you do everything here, you'll develop a pretty good plan. But just like our quotes in the beginning of this topic said, your plan, the act of planning is going to be the most beneficial, because the plan is not going to be successful, but the process of planning can get you to understand what went into it, how to adjust when needed. So let's go ahead and move on to actually developing a category plan, since we talked about how we should look into it, how to get all the information. So let's develop our category plan in the next video.